Revolution Radio proudly presents, live from the heart of the Blue Ridge, Roanoke, Virginia. It's the Just Bernard Show with host Bernard Alvarez. Join Bernard as he shares topics that reveal the real matrix and empower your human experience, including world liberty, the esoteric, suppressed technologies, spiritual ascension, and human consciousness. Humanity has awakened, and our time has come to realize our full potential. And now, live from the Star City, your host, Bernard Alvarez.
Let me tell you a little bit about our guest today. Micah Hanks is a journalist, a full-time journalist. He's also a radio personality, author and investigator of the unexplained. Since an early age, he has been fascinated with strange mysteries and Fortean phenomena, a field of study for the pioneering researcher of, named for the pioneering researcher of all things strange, Charles Fort. Hank's exposure to Fort's work, as well as the later writings of personalities such as zoologist Ivan T. Sanderson, cosmologist Carl Sagan, and several others, helped establish an open-minded but inherently skeptical approach to studying the unexplained, which Hanks maintains and continues to cultivate today, much like his numerous influences of the past decades. And we are going to find out more about all of this. Let's welcome to the show Micah Hanks. Hello, Micah. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure, truly, to be here with you.
And it's truly a pleasure to have you. We love discussing everything dealing with UFO here on this particular program. And you have such a wonderful, for lack of a better term, a resume. You've been on many television shows. You've been on the History Channel. You've been on Jeff Rense's program, CNN Radio, and apparently you have developed quite a reputation for an expert on ufology, if that's what we want to call it. Can you tell us a little bit of what got you involved in going and taking this life path to become the Micah Hanks that you are today?
Well, Bernard, it's very difficult, as I'm sure you and your listeners know, to be an expert in a subject that we really, in truth, know so little about. I think that there are a lot of people who call themselves UFO experts. I'm a person who says, I think that there are certain things that we know about what we perceive as being the UFO phenomenon. And when I say UFO phenomenon, I specifically mean a technological presence in our midst or the appearance thereof. And I think that there are a lot of presumptions beyond that are made that many feel constitutes what we quote-unquote call ufology. One of those presumptions is the idea that, for instance, UFOs are piloted by extraterrestrial beings from other worlds. Now, that very well may be the case, but as I have come along the road of life and the path of experience, what I've found more and more is that what we think we know really is based on a presumption. And people get angry at me often when I come to them and I say, where is the hard proof? There's plenty of evidence of something. I don't think that we can at all, exclude the possibility of extraterrestrials, and certainly we cannot discount, and I say again, we cannot discount that UFOs exist. But what do we really know about them, and what are they? People get angry because they feel that I challenge their beliefs when I ask those kind of questions and make those kind of statements. If they're a skeptic, they say, well, how can you say UFOs exist? You have no proof of extraterrestrials. People who believe in ET visiting Earth say, how dare you say that that's not what we're dealing with when all the evidence seems to point in that direction? Some of it does, but again, there's a difference between evidence and proof. And for me, it's been a lifelong process coming to these determinations, breaking myself away from the presumptuous attitude and looking at things only based on what we actually know. And so in terms of where I come from, I could take it all the way back to a book by Raymond Fowler that was given to me literally, Bernard, when I was about 5 or 6 years old. Every parent wants their child to read and to be involved in school. Well, every good parent will say at least. And so mine were certainly good parents. And My father specifically was always trying to give me books and things. My mother would always tell me stories to try and incite my curiosity. They noticed that I tended to gravitate towards stories that dealt with folklore and the unexplained, and at some point, around the age of 5 or 6, I was given a book by Raymond Fowler, along with some other books. You'd mentioned in the wonderful introduction that you gave me, and thank you for that. You'd mentioned Ivan Sanderson, the late zoologist. One of his books was also given to me, Abominable Snowman Legend Come to Life. But along with that was this book by Raymond Fowler called UFOs Interplanetary Visitors. Now think about that title, UFOs Interplanetary Visitors. When that term, UFO, the acronym, began to see popular use, what we were actually dealing with was the Air Force trying to get away from what had up to that point been the popular term, which was flying saucer. Flying saucer, of course, seems to entail, again, something that is very otherworldly. It's almost something more in the realm of science fiction than in science fact, and yet the Air Force felt that they were dealing with something that was a very valid and real and physical, tangible phenomenon that represented something that could be of concern to national security. And so they began to utilize, after Edward Ruppelt took over the famous Project Blue Book, he was the one that coined this term, they began to utilize UFO rather than flying saucer. And yet I still see people, in fact, people who I respect very much, such as Stanton Friedman, the nuclear physicist and, of course, renowned UFO expert. In his book, Flying Saucers in Science, he utilizes that old term. Now, there's nothing wrong with using that term, but I think that what's important is to identify the difference between a flying saucer, which is an actual disc, typically metallic, sometimes glowing, and sometimes fitted with other features that are fairly common throughout different UFO literatures and things like that. In fact, one such flying saucer was featured on the cover of the mass market paperback edition of the Ray Fowler book that I just mentioned, UFOs Interplanetary Visitors. That flying saucer has become somewhat synonymous with UFO, but unidentified flying objects, as the Air Force preferred to term them, have come and gone in many different forms and varieties. In some instances, they appear to be just little kind of round, spherical, metallic probes, if you will, often far too small to be anything that a person could actually travel in. So again, the idea of drones that's so popular in the media today, that comes into question with regard to UFO technologies just as well. Sometimes we have these giant triangles. Sometimes we have huge motherships. Sometimes we have things that appear to be, if anything, maybe at best quasi-physical, that literally can appear, disappear, and do all kinds of strange things to their liking. And so I began to realize as I studied the phenomenon over the years that we are dealing with something that is far more complex than simply what we can give that very basic jurisdiction, flying saucers or extraterrestrial spaceships. There appears to be something that literally challenges what we would conceive as being our reality, our consensus reality at least, and it pushes us to look beyond maybe the fringes of what we consider to be reality on a perceptual level. And so for me, the UFO, as Dr. Jacques Vallée has said in the past, in a technical sense, really represents something that basically harnesses a lot of energy, a tremendous amount of energy in a very small confined space. Outside of the technical aspect, the UFO, in terms of its sociological implications, the cultural implications, even the religious and the folkloric and mythological realms that are affected by the presence of the UFO in our modern society, it represents something that's far greater. And for me, it is literally kind of, an escape pod, if you will, jettisoning from the larger ship that gets us out further into the reaches of the imagination, and allows us to ask questions about what we actually perceive as reality and what our role within all that is. I don't think that maybe UFOs can be so simply explained as just being extraterrestrial craft. And it could have different levels of psychological influence on us as well as the physical and even maybe the quasi-dimensional. Again, there are so many unanswered questions, and so trying to seek to address them all is very difficult. And in doing so, coming back to my initial statement, we find that yes, it's very difficult to be a quote-unquote expert on something we truly know so little about in the grand scheme of things. So although I appreciate being called an expert, I'm also willing to say I'm something of a neophyte, and maybe we all are.
Yeah. I can relate to that where myself, I deal with the metaphysical, which is very hard to really be an expert at as well.
Certainly.
And speaking of that, I can't help but remember that you had mentioned in one of your interviews, you named like a transdimensional craft, and you called it an APO or something to that. I forgot what terminology you used, but I found it very interesting that you brought that into the fold, that perhaps there are transdimensional, or as you said, quasi-dimensional beings that are trying to make contact.
Well, certainly. Again, I won't rule out any possibility. What my gut really tells me is that probably the greater number of what we perceive as being UFO encounters in modern times and in the last several decades, the majority of those, I think, are probably terrestrial craft of apparently exotic origin. But again, I don't mean to imply that we're actually utilizing reverse engineering technology. I think quite the contrary. There are just probably very advanced technologies that exist here on planet Earth, and that we simply, in terms of a casual survey of history and science, we are unable to account for these. Now, that presents a lot of questions, and I've looked at every different possible, well, maybe not every different possible explanation, but I've certainly tried to brainstorm and look at a number of them. And I've looked at everything from a technology that could evade temporality altogether, which I do kind of distinguish from being purely what we'd call time travel. I've noticed recently that a few people who have reviewed my book have, actually all the reviews are good except for maybe one or two on Amazon.com. And I've told everyone who when I'm talking about my book or if I'm doing an interview, I tell people to go read those bad reviews, because unfortunately they generally look at my book as though the UFO Singularity, which is the latest book, they look at that book as though I'm merely peddling a quote-unquote pet theory that has to do with UFOs being time machines, or the pilots, the occupants of these UFOs, the UFO nauts, if you will, to borrow the old term from the 1960s, that these individuals or these intelligences piloting these things are literally just people who are traveling to Earth from our temporal future. I don't think it's, again, as simple as that, and that's kind of a pop culture way of looking at this. I would argue that in the future, if we utilize technologies that are so vast and great that we can get around the limitations of what I think time is, which is a perceptual artifact, if you will, I don't think that you need a time machine if time doesn't exist, and so it's not really time travel. And I guess, with all due respect to the negative reviewers, I don't think they understood what I was trying to say with the book, and therefore they wrote a bad review because they said, "Oh, everyone's talked about time travel. This is nothing new, Mr. Hanks." Well, actually, quite the contrary. Maybe you misunderstood what I was trying to say. And in trying to formulate new ideas about what we're dealing with, again, something that is, rather than just being a time travel phenomenon, something that evades temporality altogether. Temporality being a perceptual state that humans perceive based on our limited ability to experience the full range of what we, again, may perceive as reality, and what we may eventually come to perceive, if not already, as varying dimensional states. So is that possibility that there are technologies that may extend from what we would call the perceptual future, or maybe even what we would call something in another dimensional state? Is there a possibility that some UFO phenomenon is rooted in those kinds of locales, or those concepts? If nothing else, we can call them concepts at least. I think that that's certainly a possibility, and yes, that perhaps some UFO phenomenon is, in that context, interdimensional or non-temporal.
Right. So what do you mean exactly when you refer to, well, the title of the book, the UFO Singularity? What is the UFO Singularity?
Well, the UFO singularity is, again, kind of an archetype, to borrow the words of Carl Jung, in the sense that it is a concept within our, I guess, collective consciousness, human culture. It transcends any one particular, demographic or society. I mean, I think this is kind of across the board in different religious interpretations and mythologies, that humans will eventually reach this point of whatever it is. It may be nirvana, it may be enlightenment, it may be the epitome of human evolution, it may be, a religious kind of awakening. It could be literally what we might liken to being a second coming. There have been other people who have written about singularity outside the context of what I specifically focus on in this book, technological singularity, who address all these sorts of things, and occasionally in relation to UFOs. But what I specifically mean when I say the UFO singularity is in regard to technological singularity, which can be defined probably at its simplest by saying the creation of intelligence that exceeds natural levels of human intelligence. That, at that point, which probably will either integrate artificial intelligence into our society, or it may utilize technologies that amplify human intelligence with brain-computer interfaces and things like that. That, in the most basic terms, is what technological singularity is. And so when I look at UFO phenomenon, again, this is something that can at times be difficult for people to grasp, because when I say UFO, I think people are talking, or rather, I think a lot of people perceive UFO to mean exclusively alien spaceships. So they say, what's the connection here between aliens and this technological singularity you're looking at? I ask people to take a step back and remove themselves from that conventional interpretation of UFOs as being alien intelligence and say, let's just look at them as being an intelligence, because really, in terms of what evidence we have, they appear to be technological in origin. They appear to be intelligently controlled. Really, all we can seek to try and determine based on that limited information is that we are dealing with an intelligence of some variety, employing a technology, and that intelligence may be based on what the technology seems to be capable of in some of the better witness cases and things like that. What we appear to be dealing with is an intelligence that may be greater than natural human intelligence, or at least what we know to be intelligence that we have access to and technologies that we have access to. So when we look at technological singularity as being the next step in human evolution, so to speak, and exceeding human intelligence, maybe with UFO phenomenon, we are already seeing instances where we have a technology and an intelligence in our midst that has been in our midst for quite some time that actually does that already. It exceeds what humans naturally are capable of in the present day. Now, there are a number of reasons why that may be or how that could have come to pass, ranging from the terrestrial to the quasi-dimensional to the extraterrestrial. There are all different ways that we can approach that problem in, I think, a logical, philosophical sense. But at the very heart of the matter, that is what the UFO singularity is the parallel between reaching the next stage in human development and the apparent presence of something in our midst that already seems to represent that. That, Bernard, I think presents quite a conundrum, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And I can't help what you're talking about as far as these being intelligence in itself. What comes to mind for me is a lot of these experiences that we see, perhaps people that do the work with Stephen Greer or at the East Steady Ranch, where literally there seems to be some type of psychic connection between the people on the ground and the craft. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, if you've seen any of that or if you have any concepts on that.
Well, I certainly do. Stephen Greer is a rather controversial figure. I think that you can have this conversation outside of just Greer's work. I respect really what Dr. Greer tries to do, but I think that in a sense he also is someone who, in terms of the exopolitics movement, as it's called, I think he kind of caves to those same memes, if you will, in terms of, well, we are convinced that UFOs are alien. Now, maybe Stephen Greer, I think he actually has in the past, would tell folks like you or I that he actually has seen proof that UFOs are alien without question. My question is that, if that proof exists, maybe there are truly reasons why that information can't be released to the public. I have not seen compelling evidence that without question removes other possibilities. I, again, look at extraterrestrial phenomenon and the apparent presence of it, or the apparent presence of it in relation to UFOs. I look at that as only one potential, but also one that is as yet unproven. It may be the strongest potential, but it is as yet unproven. And so with Dr. Greer, that's the only criticism I would really have of Stephen Greer, is that he kind of presumes that we're talking about extraterrestrials, and that furthermore that we can have psychic interactions with them. What I don't think you can deny is the fact that people have, in many instances, claimed to have had that kind of a nonverbal communication or some sort of an otherwise conscious connection, if you will, to phenomenon that we would term, and maybe the acronym that you had mentioned that I'd utilized at some point in the past was UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon. Yeah. I actually kind of prefer that to UFO, just because, again, UFOs become so systematically compared with alien technology. Let's just call it UAP. Richard Dolan, my good friend and colleague, uses this terminology because that seems to kind of be more across the board in terms of what we're dealing with. When a person is experiencing the observation of UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon, and when they make a conscious decision to say, gosh, what if that thing just took off and flew in a circle, and then this object does this? Or even stranger, a person sees no object and they think on a clear starry night they're walking along, they say, wouldn't it be neat if I saw a UFO, and then the thing appears? That's interesting. And that does seem to happen quite a lot in the literature, and it does suggest that there is some sort of a level of connectivity between the observer and then the apparent phenomenon, which again gets into the concept of, well, is this an entirely physical phenomenon, or is it something that is really more of a kind of an artifact of our perception of reality that we perceive as being something physical and technological, when in fact it could be something far more strange and more difficult to explain on human terms. But that level of connectivity does certainly exist, and I certainly commend Dr. Greer for attempting to try and explore what that connection may be by, holding these gatherings and meetings where people try and basically have, I guess he calls them CE5s, correct?
I believe so, yeah.
So I commend him for that, because, again, right now at our present level of science and understanding of scientific applications, there's very little we can do to prove that what he's doing is effective, and yet people say that it is. And so what I say is that while we may not be able to bring to the table hard, empirical, and experiential data with regard to those experiences, we can continue to learn about that, and as our own science develops and we get nearer and nearer to what we might call synthetic telepathy and different things like that that are going to literally just break the thresholds on human perception and ability. At one point on down the road, if that is a viable way of communicating with whatever this intelligence is, we may reach a scientific point where we can validate that. At present, it's difficult to do, but we can continue to study the phenomenon and build a database for use at that time when we are able to determine exactly what that connection is and what's going on.
Right. And I guess that makes the most sense, is to just collect the data and learn from it.
Mm-hmm.
Your book talks a lot about what futurists call transhumanism, and that's a very sensitive subject for a lot of people, and how it relates to the concept of technological singularity. What does this have to do with UFOs?
That's another good question. It's funny because even in relation to other subjects, I'm asked that often. For instance, I'm a co-planner and a co-host for an event in Minneapolis later this year called, actually it's St. Paul, it's called the Paradigm Symposium. And while that is really kind of geared toward ancient mysteries, the Paradigm Symposium, it's funny because here I am, a person who is a futurist, and I'm billed on the website for the Paradigm Symposium, which is paradigmsymposium.com. I'm billed right there on the website as a futurist. And I'm sure people go and they look at that website and they say, what's this guy doing in here? He's not talking about ancient mysteries and things like that. But in a sense, it really does tie into ancient mysteries. I think that transhumanism certainly ties into UFO phenomenon. And so the way that I would try and first define transhumanism is, again, in terms of what we look at with singularity and how we'll utilize technologies that will, if not amplify human abilities and intelligence levels, we will create new kinds of synthetic intelligences and things like that. Really, transhumanism falls under that. And there are two ways of looking at it. I guess that there is just the biological approach where we will eventually evolve into something else that may not be what we would call human today. Again, our earliest ancestors do not appear to be what we would call human today. If we are human and we came from something else, there is, if we, of course, continue unhindered, there's the possibility that we will become something else later on down the road, too. So that, I think, entails one aspect of transhumanism, but more conventional interpretations of it are directly related with technological singularity in the sense that we utilize technologies to essentially take evolution into our own hands. Now, yes, it is very potentially dangerous. Any kind of scientific pursuit of that nature certainly has both promise potential as well as negative aspects, but I think that really for me, I look at it as being something that is very similar to what we would call conscious evolution. We identify a problem, racism, or some sort of a problem that we have in our society. We identify that there's no need for that in terms of what we have evolved to be, but that maybe for some reason we've evolved to be, for instance, capable of perceiving the environment in a certain way. And so there are societal problems that we have, such as, for instance, class warfare, racism. We've heard about that a lot in the United States recently with the Trayvon Martin case and whatnot. I think that we can, if we're indeed able to evolve in a conscious way, maybe we have evolved to a point where we understand, okay, whatever path evolution has brought us to has made some of us different from others. And maybe as a result of that, there are natural reasons why we would be, for whatever reason, prone to conflict. But we can identify those problems and we can choose to say, you know what, we are all equal. We are all the same. And there's no reason that we have to continue to fight like we might have done in the Middle Ages or earlier than that in ancient times, which obviously conflict was probably, if anything, very conducive to evolution in terms of survival of the fittest. Conflict was also useful in terms of protection. But don't we work better as a society today and a civilization worldwide when we don't enter conflict? At one time that was helpful. It is no longer. And if we can make a decision, that is what I would call conscious evolution. And so transhumanism gets into that as well, I think, in terms of looking at it positively, the choices that we can make and the ability to utilize science to improve ourselves on a worldwide scope for the better. I don't think it always has to be a negative thing, but again, there's always good with the bad, hills and valleys.
Well, like with all technology, it's a tool that can be utilized for positive or negative, depending on who's using it. Unfortunately, and fortunately for us, hopefully we're moving into the direction where it is going to be used to do something positive, not only for ourselves, but like you said, with society. Now, what does all of this have to do with UFOs?
With regard to UFOs, again, I think we look at where we came from in terms of our evolutionary past, and we see, okay, we can definitely tie this into ancient mysteries and the mystery of our origins. When it comes to where are we going, I would argue that sometimes there's the old chicken and the egg argument. And when we see something like a UFO, let's just presume for the moment, Bernard, that when we first in the 1940s began to observe what appeared to be highly advanced technologies, let's presume that those were our own. Sometimes they say necessity is the mother of invention, but I think more often observation trumps necessity. And when we observe something that appears to be so incredible, I think that we would be hard-pressed to say that humans would observe what appear to be UFO technologies, flying saucers, if you will, and not attempt to design some for ourselves. We see also that, for instance, the Canadian project that was known as the Avro car that was being developed in the 1950s, there were clearly aircraft that were being developed that looked a lot.
Micah, I'm sorry to cut you off. We're about to go on break. We'll be right back.
And now, back to your host, Bernard Alvarez.
Welcome back to the Just Bernard Show here on Revolution Radio. We are having a fantastic discussion today with Micah Hanks and his new book, The UFO Singularity. Now, just before the break, Micah, you were mentioning something to the effect of how the ancients looked at modern technology and we got cut off. Could you kind of share that thought again with us?
Well, sure. I mean, I think earlier we were kind of looking at the parallels between ancient mysteries and things like that and transhumanism. In other words,
yes,
where we have come from, what we are now, and what we eventually will become. And when we look at UFO technologies, I believe I left off saying that I would be hard-pressed to find no case to be made, I suppose, that if humans were to observe some sort of a technology that appeared to be greater than what we were capable of, that we would, that we wouldn't try and copy it. I think it's quite obvious that indeed, if we could assert that UFOs do appear to be from elsewhere, that inspires humans to try and design similar things. And so, in a funny way, the mere observation of UFO technologies and strange phenomenon could serve a purpose in the continuation of what we are becoming in our own technological prowess and things like that. In other words, when that idea is introduced, it is the literal direct inspiration derived from that idea that pushes us forward. And so UFOs would not have to be, for instance, crashed and then, for all we know, captured and re-engineered or reverse engineered and then made into something from which humans are capable of basically pushing ourselves to the next technological plateau, if you will. Another thing that's anecdotally interesting to look at in those terms is we often talk about such things as the crash at Roswell. Now, I've looked at that case for years, and I'm less convinced now than I used to be that there was an actual exotic craft that crashed there. But if there were, we often look at this in terms of there being something that allegedly crashed in the desert and that it was an advanced technology. It was covered up, and then the bodies were taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and the wreckage was later, if not reassembled, it was studied, and it was one of many instances where we obtained technology that we've been able to reverse engineer, and now some of these things seen out there that we call UFOs are our own. If that indeed were the case, or anything similar to that, again, another problem that people have put forth over the years is that if this was such an advanced technology, this UFO craft, then how were they so clumsy as to lose control and their craft was literally downed and crashed, and not only at Roswell but in other instances too. There are a number of cases that took place around that time that came to light much later, and people had alleged that even at times that radar and such devices as the radar and the and other kinds of technologies that the U.S. Air Force and different agencies were utilizing might be capable of disrupting the guidance systems or something on these craft, and that's what actually caused these craft to crash. It seems less likely, if this technology were indeed that advanced, that something so simple as radar would take them down. But if we were to presume that there had been an intentional crash, what we would perceive as a crash, but literally it might be more like what we would consider, throwing a ball into the court and with a bunch of kids out there playing together and everything, and they all of a sudden see this bright shiny thing and they're like, ooh, what's this? And they start playing and doing different things. In that context, we might look at a quote-unquote crash as actually being some sort of technology purposefully being handed to humanity for purposes of study. And again, we wouldn't have to necessarily create that technology on our own. Observation of an existent technology of exotic origin could lead to humans building something on those terms for ourselves. And so in terms of where we are going eventually as humans in transhumanism, I think that UFOs come into that equation in a variety of different ways. And I think that even without crashes, even without recovered discs, and without a back-engineered craft and things like that, observation alone of an apparently exotic technology could be something that will push us to the next level. And for all we know, I think that that may already be taking place, and there could be highly advanced technologies out there based on what we've observed UFOs doing over the years. And again, a lot of that could be taking place on a clandestine level in government that most of us on the conventional level are just unaware of.
Right, very much so. And I can't help but wonder, Micah, you're speaking a lot about our technology of the future, and you speak of it in your book. Does this literally mean that you think that UFOs represent time travelers from our own future?
Well, as I'd said earlier, I don't feel that it's necessarily as simple as just people in the future build a time machine, travel back in time, and they come and observe the past. I think quite the contrary, that time is a perceptual illusion, and that based on what we have evolved to be as three-dimensional physical beings, I think that we perceive chronological time, if you will, as a result of how we've evolved. But based on things, and I get into this in the book a little bit, we look at such things as Einsteinian relativity, and I love to talk about time dilation in regard to that, where we began to observe, and again, this is something that's been repeated in science many times. If we look at time dilation, we see that time as we perceive it is not necessarily how time actually is. It's not this unbendable constant, if you will. We perceive time as one thing, but it can be quite pliable when you bring such things as gravity into effect, or when you bring such things as, a person or an object relative to the speed on, if for instance you put it on board a aircraft or something like that, aircraft traveling further from the gravitational pull of planet Earth at a high speed is going to cause strange effects in terms of the passage of time relative to the objects or the individuals on board that craft. And so what we find is that, and the classic experiment involves taking a clock. Two clocks are timed perfectly in sync with one another. One stays on a ground level next to a swimming pool, in a garden, in an office, in a laboratory, wherever. Another is put on board an aircraft that flies high into the sky, further, of course, from the central source of gravity emanating from planet Earth and traveling at a high speed. And as a result of the speed that is being traveled and the distance from planet Earth, there is a minute difference in the passage of time between the two clocks. And when that clock travels, let's say, once around the Earth and comes back, and the two are compared, they were once synced perfectly, and now they're out of sync because of the way that time, as we perceive it, has passed differently relative to the individual clocks. So we see that there are a lot of environmental influences, physical influences that can actually affect the flow of time, and that it's not just some sort of an incredible, amazing constant that permeates all aspects of our universe. And what that shows us is that as human beings, we're perceiving time relative to our own placement in space-time, relative to our own position, relative to the Earth, or relative to an aircraft we may be traveling in, or eventually a spaceship that carries us to a distant star system. And since time is somewhat pliable, and humans, and although we can't perceive that you or I sitting here in a room or talking on a radio program or watching TV or walking down the street, at some point we may utilize technologies that will transcend the perceptual limitations of time. And that seems to point to the old idea that time is something that humans have created. It's a concept more than an actual physical existent law or force. And if that's the case, if time in terms of physical laws or forces does not really exist, I would argue that you don't need a time traveling machine in order to travel through time if there's no time to travel through. I think that in the future we may utilize technologies that can get around the perceptual limitations that we perceive as being time and chronological passage through it. And in that context, some UFO technologies may be what we would call something that emanates from the perceptual future, but that it may not be literally that they're traveling through time and then they go back to their period. And, they may be able to travel through what we would call time as simply as, a plane could fly from San Diego to New York. In other words, passage through what we call time may be actually more likened to physical passage through space, which we are capable of it right now. We just don't have the technology to be able to do the same thing with time. And maybe these UFO technologies are capable of something along those lines. It's a little difficult to frame that argument because, again, here I am. I'm a human being. I'm at least as far as I know I am. And I'm a three-dimensional physical being. I perceive time just like anyone else does. Age and entropy and these sorts of things affect me just the same way that they would affect anyone else. And I've spoken with a lot of my friends, especially those of the religious persuasion, and I'm a spiritual person, and I was raised religious. I think I've changed my feelings about a lot of that as I've gotten older in relation to my perception of what we might call metaphysical studies, as you've, of course, mentioned earlier, Doctor. But I look at something like religion and my friends who I talk about this temporal evasion to, and one of them, a good friend of mine named Susan, had said to me recently at breakfast, but I think that humans have evolved, and this is of course getting in the idea of religion and spirituality entailing that there's also a purpose to life and existence. And she said, I think if we've evolved in such a way that we perceive time as we do right now, that there's a reason for that because there's an intention behind this universe and our role that we play in that. And so I don't think that we are intended to get around time, and therefore I don't think we'll ever utilize technologies that will get around that. I would simply say that, first, I think that we will, and two, when it comes to the spiritual looking or the spiritual implications that all this involves, free will, getting around such things as aging, dying, and death, or even being born for that matter. A lot of people say, we're getting very close to playing God when we're talking about transhuman technologies that would get rid of time, let alone allow us to travel, forward or backward into the future. Just get rid of it altogether and let us do anything. You're playing God, and that's just not good. But maybe that's not the case, because when we look back at the Judeo-Christian concept of God, I think that we often look at God as being something far greater than us. God is a being who creates us. He is omnipotent, omniscient, all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful. He creates us in His image, maybe in spiritual image, maybe in physical. Probably it's the former rather than the latter. And then when we are created in the image of the spiritual divine being, we have this perception as the created that the Creator is always greater than us. When a mother or a father creates a child, they consciously do that. The child is an infant. The child is incapable of mastering its environment. It has to be helped significantly, nurtured. As time goes on, that child becomes more dependent. We could liken that to being free will. As time goes on, as the parents age and wither and grow older and they reach the sunset of their lifetimes, all of a sudden the child is, in most instances, obligated and, of course, also equipped to be able to kind of carry out a reversal of roles where the created is now looking after the creators. I think that if a God creates, and if there is a God, and if we are a creation of that God, who's to say that in some ways we may not go on as, and if we want to bring this into a kind of a scriptural way, and I'm not preaching here, I'm actually trying to look at this in terms of bringing mythology, culture, and religion into it for comparison's sake, but we see in the New Testament that Christ says, you will go on to perform greater miracles than I have. That to me is evidence of the human potential that free will gives us. With or without a God, if we're going in that direction, we may at some point be greater than and capable of more things than one who created us was. And to me, that's not blasphemous. That's not wicked. That's not evil. I think that that's, and of course, I'm framing this all in more symbolic and mythological terms here to illustrate a point. I think that, in other words, it's okay for us to understand that we can go on and that we can become greater than what we are right now, and that we will evoke new, intelligences along the way, new technologies, and eventually we may literally get to a point where we are no longer exactly what we are today, but that could all be a part of what we might call the divine plan. So, very long story short, I think that in terms of understanding what role we play in all this, whether it has to do with time travel, as you termed it, whether it has to do with religion and spirituality, sometimes it requires us, or UFOs obviously, it requires us to kind of take a step back, redefine what we're looking at and what quantities we're dealing with and what in relation to them our role is. And I think that our concepts are fairly limited as a result of, general ideas, myth perceptions, not myths, but myth perceptions, right. Notice I say, that we've kind of collected over time.
Now, on that note, as far as the idea of human evolution and whatnot, we hear a lot about, within the UFO community, we hear how, the aliens are never going to help us, or that they're never going to join us, that we are what's the word that they use? I can't think of it right now, but that we are in, I can't think of it right now, but that we cannot be a part of a galactic society because we have not evolved to that point. And I believe it's Michio Kaku that talks about the different levels of planetary evolution. And I wonder what your thoughts are on this whole concept that we are, we're being cut off from the rest of the galactic, I don't know if you want to call it the galactic organizations or hierarchy or whatever, because of the fact that we haven't found it yet, that we haven't figured out how to take care of each other. And I forgot the levels that Michio Kaku describes, but he talks about how through the evolutionary process that a planet would eventually be able to work with other life forms and whatnot.
Well, I think, first of all, we should address the Fermi paradox. I've been asked an awful lot lately about that. And this essentially addresses what some scientists feel is an apparent contradiction between the probability of the existence of other life out there in our universe, and then our lack of contact with them as humans. And we can't seem to find any evidence of intelligent civilizations, alien beings, and things like that. Now, again, many UFO people would be saying, hello, it's right there in front of your face. I say that there is something right here in front of our face. I say that we have evidence of something that is truly irrefutable. I could not tell you what that evidence entails, and it may not be so simple as flesh and blood alien beings, grays, if you will, traveling to Earth to study us or to try and improve us or God knows what else. So when we talk about the Fermi paradox, or what some call the Great Silence, I think that scientists and speculative physicists like Michio Kaku have gone to great lengths to try and understand the necessity for silence in a universe where probability would indicate that there has to be other life like us. And one of those is the concept that indeed humans aren't allowed to be a part of something just yet. And people who assert a UFO portion of this equation, they literally cite the incidents where UFOs apparently are capable of taking down nuclear weapons test sites and things like that. And they say, you know what? It's obvious that these are not only intelligent and highly evolved extraterrestrial beings, but they're here to protect us from ourselves. And they're basically trying to teach us how to be a more peaceful civilization ourselves, so that then we can receive that kind of indoctrination into the Great Galactic Federation. Now, to me, unfortunately, that's a lot more like science fiction. And even when we see people in science, like Michio Kaku, speculating about what may keep us from being a part of this apparent presence of extraterrestrial intelligences throughout our universe, that probability should dictate, and based on that probability, that we should be able to observe evidence of at some point. While we haven't found it already, who knows? I think that it's easy to say that, well, okay, we've got a Class 1 civilization or a Class 2 civilization, and a Class 1 civilization does this, a Class 2 does this, and we're not even close to being a Class 1, according to Kaku's predictions, and therefore, probably our technology is very limited. Now, I think he's partially right in the sense that based on what our technology allows us to do, we may not have utilized technology to a point where we have enhanced our own perception of reality so that we are on par with the technology that we would even be looking for. It could be that we are surrounded by technologies and that we simply have not been able to utilize technology of our own that puts us on par with observing them. The example that Michio Kaku would give would be that if we see ants, and ants are in an ant hill, and they're operating busily by the side of the road, they're woefully unaware of the presence of giant alien beings traveling in highly advanced what would you call them? I mean, aside from calling them cars,
right.
Up and down the road. These ants are woefully unaware of the people who are nearby them who are a greater intelligence, and they go about their work and what they're doing. And so it could very well be that humans are kind of like those ants. We're carrying out our work. We're going along. We're doing our things here on planet Earth, oblivious to technologies and intelligences that could be right around us, all around us. UFOs may be some of those, for all we know. But I also see that scientists tend to pretty painfully anthropomorphize what we expect of aliens. We expect that aliens and intelligence, even consciousness, let alone, that all these things are going to manifest in the very same ways in an alien intelligence, or at least in very similar ways. It could be that consciousness is merely one stage in evolution, and that when one gets to a point of intelligent awareness that they transcend what we would call consciousness, that form of intelligence is so great that as a conscious civilization ourselves, as conscious three-dimensional physical beings, we may not be able to perceive incredibly advanced intelligences in our midst because they have evolved beyond the sort of perception that even equates to what we would call consciousness and perception. And so there are so many things we have to look at beyond the anthropomorphic attitudes toward alien life in terms of trying to come to a full understanding of why we have not found evidence of intelligent life. And one theory that I've tossed around for quite some time now is that perhaps if singularity and transhuman concepts can be applied to humans, they could be applied to technologies elsewhere. And that before an intelligence gets to a point where it is capable of utilizing, Stone Age techniques for purpose of communication, like radio astronomy and the SETI programs we're talking about right now, they literally get to a point of technological development that enhances their own intelligence and perception to a level where those old concepts of reaching out and communication are no longer valid or even important. And once we get to that stage ourselves, if we utilize highly advanced technology in the future to amplify our own intelligence, or we literally create new kinds of intelligence, those may be the stepping stones that lead us to discovery of other life out there.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. As a matter of fact, you're bringing to mind I forgot who the guest was that we had on here this year. He was speaking of the human consciousness evolution, and was making comparisons. I believe we were on the topic of Atlantis, and he was saying that you could see where human consciousness kind of devolved from the Atlantean quote unquote paradigm of being able to, let's say, maybe they were able to use telekinesis, maybe they were able to fly without planes, and then that now we've entered into a place where we're having to use tools like technology, like you said, like using a radio or a car, and that perhaps that is going to be one of the parts of our consciousness development.
Oh, absolutely. And I would just assert here briefly that I look at intelligence and the utilization of technology as a result of intelligence. I look at them as highly specialized circumstances. In other words, when an intelligent species, a civilization, begins to utilize technology, again, we could define this technology as manipulating, if you will, space and matter for purposes of creating circumstances, devices, mechanics that improve the way that we exist within that environment. And so the specialization comes into a question when, for instance, we look at the ancient pyramids of Egypt. We look at these mysteries of the past and we say, gosh, how could people back then, with their limited intelligence and their limited technology, how could they have built these massive structures? And so what do people do? They gravitate toward an extraterrestrial explanation for that. They say, obviously, they had some help. When in truth, on terms of a scale between the pyramids and what we would presume an extraterrestrial intelligence would have to have at their disposal in order to travel to Earth and help build those things, the pyramids would equate to being great big mud pies sitting out in the middle of the Sahara. So I think that the important thing to look at is that, or wherever else, rather, not just the Sahara. I mean, there are pyramids all over the Earth. The point is that I think it's very unlikely that an incredibly advanced technology came to Earth and built great big stone mounds as the testament to what their technology could do. Quite the contrary, as the late Philip Coppens, dear friend of mine, had said, I think that we have to look at what the actual ancient Egyptian technologies were capable of. And we have to look at those outside the concepts that we apply to architecture and to all different sorts of things today. We have to look at Egyptian pyramids and such monuments as not being evidence of anti-gravity, but as evidence of probably innovations that we might not have ever thought about, but in a specialized society who, for purposes of wanting to build some sort of a great totem or monument like a pyramid, they were fully capable of doing it, and they found a way to do it, and in such a way that was advanced enough that it continues to elude us to this very day. Robert Bauval, who's a gentleman I've managed to speak with recently, and he's going to be a speaker at this year's Paradigm Symposium. He's a fascinating guy, and he is someone who, speaking with him, he really changed my own mind about a lot of this, and the implications for technologies that may have existed in ancient times. Just because they were ancient people did not mean that they were not formidable thinkers and that they may have utilized a highly specialized kind of technology. So again, I think that the relationship between intelligence and technology is one that is highly specialized, and that it often has more to do with what the circumstances require rather than just what humans are going to gravitate toward, across the board. People are going to utilize technologies in very different ways based on what they need those technologies to do at a given time.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we are coming up on the top of the hour here, we're going to be taking a break in just about a half a minute here. I wanted to let all of our listeners know where they can find your book and a website that they could start looking up and following your work.
Well, absolutely. The best place to find me online right now is MicahHanks.com. That's M-I-C-A-H, Hanks just like the actor Tom. Mm-hmm. MicahHanks.com. You're going to find news about my different things that I'm looking into, as well as my weekly program on the KGRA radio network, the Micah Hanks program. Now, for free, you can also download the Gralien Report, which is a podcast I've been doing for about 3 years. The website for that is gralienreport.com. And, of course, you can also see updates and news and things about all my different stuff.
All right, we'll be right back. Thank you, Micah.
And now, back to your host, Bernard Alvarez.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Just Bernard Show here on Revolution Radio. We have been having a really fantastic discussion today with Micah Hanks on his new book, The UFO Singularity. As well, Micah is going to be hosting or speaking at, is it the Paradigm Symposium, I believe it's called?
It is, yes.
Wonderful. And that's going to be in St. Paul, Minnesota. If I'm not mistaken, I believe Revolution Radio was interested in doing a live broadcast from there. I believe they had spoken to Scotty Roberts.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. Scotty, of course, is the man with the plan when it comes to Paradigm Symposium, my dear friend and brother. And of course, really, he's the guy that got the whole ball rolling. I hope we can get you guys up there. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And I love the lineup you have. Can you tell us a little bit about the symposium?
Well, certainly. Paradigm Symposium, and I may have mentioned it once or twice earlier. In other words, I'm very excited about it. This is our second year planning this event. It's really unlike a lot of the other conferences out there, because last year we had Eric von Daniken, and we had some of the big names in the field with regard to ancient aliens and things like that. We try and take a slightly different approach each year. That's going to be our plan, at least. And so for year 2, we're looking at ancient mysteries. We're looking at things like the true origins of Egyptian technology. We're looking at things like, for instance, the involvement of secret societies in our ancient past and the formulation of technology over time. We're looking at things like ancient mysteries such as the Vimanas of ancient Hindu scripts and things like that, the Mahabharata and the Rig Veda and the Bhagavad Gita, that talk about these ancient wars and conflicts that happened. These are all things that we're going to be examining at Paradigm Symposium in 2013, and it will be at the Union Depot in Minneapolis, or rather, it's actually going to be in St. Paul. They're so close to one another, it's hard to differentiate from time to time. But all that information is at ParadigmSymposium.com. I'll be a speaker there, as well as Scott Roberts and a number of other people. And it's not just ancient mysteries and Egyptian-type stuff. I mean, it really is across the board. Everything from cryptozoology and UFOs to the study of things like science. One of our other speakers is going to be Thomas Fusco, who wrote a book called Beyond the Cosmic Veil, who literally, he looks at science as it relates to all things that we might perceive as paranormal. Nick Redfern, of course, one of the most prolific authors in this field. He'll be a speaker. Anthony Sanchez, Dan Madsen, Marie D. Jones, Larry Flaxman, so many fantastic people. And so, again, I just urge people to check out ParadigmSymposium.com. I think that we've got just enough space for about 20 more people for the largest ticket, which includes a banquet dinner where you get to have dinner with all the different speakers and spend time with all of us. But there are plenty of tickets. We're getting very close. It's going to be October the 17th, the week of the 17th. So, get online. You'll want to look at those tickets right now, and don't miss this event because it's going to be just incredible. Last year was fantastic. I really enjoyed having a salad and a beverage with Eric Von Daniken and some of the fine folks that were there. So it's going to be kind of a homecoming for those who were there last year, and for folks who are just learning about it, it's the kind of event you just don't want to miss, and I hope we'll see you guys up there as well.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Sounds like a great event. Do you know if it's going to be live streamed?
There's a possibility.
Okay.
We're looking into that. We're looking into a lot of different possibilities. And so, again, folks can take a look at the website, ParadigmSymposium.com, and we'll have that information there. We always want to try and have it available to as many people as possible. But obviously, if you really want the full package, you got to try and come to St. Paul for this event. It's just unlike anything you've ever experienced.
Yeah. And plus, when you're there on the ground, it makes such a big difference than, watching it online.
Oh, sure, of course.
You get to make new friends and make new memories. And coming back to some of the topic matter in your book, and I find this very interesting, Micah, that in your book you describe World War II as a pivotal period for ufology. There is so much mystery surrounding, or at least there's talk and conspiracy talk of, the Nazis being involved in extraterrestrial work and technology and whatnot. But you really got into it a lot in your book, and I wonder why was this so important?
Well, the Second World War is interesting for a couple of different reasons. For one, I remember speaking with Stanton Friedman a few years ago, and Stanton had said there's an obvious reason for the connection between UFO technologies and the Second World War. And that obvious reason is that at the end of the Second World War, we utilized for the first time the ability that humans prior to that, at least as far as we know in modern times, we had no ability to harness the power of the atom. Hence, we utilized for the very first time atomic weaponry. And that this was a great beacon to other intelligences out there that came and saw us and go, okay, now these idiots are playing with fire. Now, for a time, I kind of looked at it and thought, maybe that is what's going on. I mean, you can't deny the fact that UFOs began to appear allegedly around the Second World War. Whereas, as time has gone on, I've begun to kind of back away from that theory that, again, that we basically attracted intelligences from elsewhere. One reason for that is because there does seem to be some precedent for what we might, for lack of a better term, call airships that have been seen in decades and maybe even centuries prior to the last one, during which the Second World War occurred. And I think, and again, a lot of people would say, okay, yeah, but we're talking about religious paintings and things like that. You can't really talk about those. No, I say that there are actually some compelling reports, some that involve what were called airships emanating from the late 1800s. There were others. One that was fantastic that was brought to our attention during the International UFO Congress this year, during a lecture by Richard Dolan. He was talking about one that he had found from I believe it was a Canadian prospector who had observed an incredible airship. And again, this account seemed to date back to a time around the turn of the last century that we shouldn't have been finding reports where people were talking about incredibly formidable aircraft of some kind. And yet this is what this individual is talking about and describing. It just kind of, strikes like a bolt of lightning in the middle of a field on a sunny day. There's no rhyme, reason, or excuse for it. There it is. There are these kind of reports from time to time that seem to indicate that what we might call UFO phenomenon has been with us much longer than just the Second World War. Now, some who would advocate an ET hypothesis would come back around to that and say, yeah, but, you got to keep in mind, they could have been here all along. They could have been the very intelligence that seeded humanity as we know it. But that doesn't remove the possibility that after the Second World War, and more importantly, the institution of atomic weaponry, that doesn't mean that these sorts of intelligences weren't more interested in what we were doing, and that explains the increased presence of UFOs. Now, for all you or I know, and all the listeners out there listening may know, that could indeed be the case. That very well could be a likelihood. But we could look at it a number of different ways, too. For instance, looking back and, assuming that there's some sort of a technological presence that appears to have been in our midst even prior to the Second World War, one thing that I've often supposed was that radar technologies that are utilized for purposes of detecting and measuring radiation, a variety of other different kinds of technologies, microwaves, and the ability to harness those for purposes of doing all different kinds of things, including cooking food in a small metal box on most of our kitchen counters. A lot of these sort of technologies did not exist prior to Second World War, and the reason that they came into fruition following the conflict is because during a time of global conflict like that, the major superpowers have an absolute necessity for being able to innovate and to create, because those new technologies could make or break in terms of their ability, any individual nation's ability to emerge victorious. Now, we know the Nazis were involved in some incredibly advanced projects, physics projects. I mean, they had very elaborate underground bunkers and underground bases and things. We talk about underground bases, and people laugh about the idea that Area 51 or a location like that could be underground. I ask people to look at the actual blueprints. A lot of this information is available in history books online. Author Joseph Farrell has spent a lot of time studying this sort of thing. There are, without question, instances where the Nazis have been utilizing advanced and very elaborate underground bases. And if you think that people today, intelligence agencies, organizations, whoever, wouldn't do that or couldn't do that, you're just flat wrong. So the thing is that there was a lot of different kind of technology being implemented during the Second World War for purposes of hiding certain technologies, like those underground bases had been intended to do. The Nazis had been working on this thing that was called the Bell. We don't know a whole lot about what that could have been, aside from the idea that I think maybe Jim Mars and a few others have asserted that it was in all likelihood some sort of a device that was intended to be used for purposes of plasma weaponry. Cascade ion technologies have been developed during the Third Reich, which, of course, today we would probably liken to being lasers. They had invented something very close to Kevlar. They had actually implemented and field-tested night vision technologies during the Second World War. The miniaturization of film equipment, television, and broadcast equipment. Of course, they had their own radar systems. They had their own highly advanced aircraft, which, at least for that time, I don't know that we could go so far as to assume that they actually had flying saucers, but the Nazis certainly had some highly advanced aircraft. They had guided missiles that they were utilizing. And so the thing is that all this technology existed. It's all in the history books, and I don't think that a lot of people have read enough about it to really understand to what extent technologically, not just the Nazis, but the Allies too, were developing technologies during the Second World War. And as a result of the necessity for having to innovate during that period, a lot of technologies like radar, which of course have famously been employed in the study of and tracking of UFOs when they appear, these sorts of technologies may have literally widened, if you will, human perception beyond what the five senses and then the 24-something other lesser senses that the human body alone can perceive. This could have widened perception, the use of such technologies, and allowed us to begin to better perceive and acknowledge a phenomenon that may have been in our midst for a very long time. And I think that that's the primary reason why the Second World War is very important to look at in conjunction with the apparent surge in reports of UFOs. And furthermore, with the advances in aviation and avionics, with the advances in photography and filming and these sorts of things, I think it made it more easy for these different organizations, such as the Air Force, for instance, to begin to acknowledge and attempt to try and study this kind of phenomenon. But if it is indeed something so foreign and exotic as the UFO phenomenon appears to be at times, I don't think that our technology then or even today has quite reached that point where we can fully understand this phenomenon. And hence, there tends to be a dismissal that we have in the academic institutions. And it's only right that people would dismiss something that we cannot fully perceive. It's kind of like walking down the street thinking you see a ghost and then doing a double take and going, did I really just see that? And then you're going to keep it to yourself. Most people would. A few people might tell everyone, oh my God, I just saw a ghost. And their friends are going to tell them, yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Other people would probably say, yeah, I'm going to keep this to myself because I think I saw it, but maybe I'm second guessing what I think I saw. Maybe I didn't see it at all. I think we do the same thing with UFOs. Until we can get to a point where we can fully perceive whether there's an entity standing there on the corner as we're walking to work in the morning, we're going to keep those things to ourselves, and there's going to be that ridicule factor.
Right. And what does this have to do with, or how does the Roswell incident figure into all of this?
Well, the Roswell incident, again, is something that's fascinating to me because I've looked at that case a lot. We mentioned it again a bit earlier. Roswell, is something that, again, I think represents something that happened. I don't know that the evidence points to a crashed flying saucer that was, and first of all, I mean, the best descriptions of the alleged craft, it didn't really sound very much like a saucer at all. I think Philip Corso, in his book The Day After Roswell, also made mention of a variety of technologies that were recovered at the wreckage, including Kevlar-type technologies and things like that, or suits that may have resembled that, or for whatever other purposes there may have been substances that resembled that. A lot of the things that were allegedly found at the wreckage site, according to Corso, are in keeping with technologies that the Nazis have been developing. But does that mean that there's a connection between the Roswell craft and Nazi technologies? Who knows? Who knows? I think that another plausible explanation might be that whatever the craft was, if there was a craft that crashed at Roswell, whatever that could have been, may have been something that had, again, emanated from here on planet Earth, utilizing what were at the time highly advanced technologies of the day. Again, maybe not advanced enough to propel this craft foolproof through Earth's atmosphere and cause this thing to crash land out there on Mac Brazel's ranch outside Roswell. And if indeed something was recovered that appeared to be foreign or exotic, we can't remove the possibility that it was based on technology that came from right here. And what's interesting about this in relation to singularity is there's this concept of what's called an intelligence explosion or a technology explosion. Now, in the future, what this would entail would be the creation of artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence that has been created then improves upon its, let's say, source code. Let's say we're talking about open source artificial intelligence. And one of the gentlemen who I interviewed in the UFO Singularity, Dr. Benjamin Gertzel, is involved in working on artificial intelligence that utilizes open source code for purposes of trying to basically get people around the world who have the time and the interest and the drive to do it to work together on a cumulative effort to design artificial intelligence. It's a very novel concept. Well, let's say that an open source artificial intelligence in the future modifies after being created, modifies its own source code, replicates its own intelligence, improves upon that intelligence. And we have a secondary variety of artificial intelligence that's even greater than the first, which does the same thing. It replicates and improves. And then that does the same, and so on and so on and so on. What happens is an intelligence explosion where intelligent beings are capable of self-replicating and improving upon themselves to the point that the end result, if there is such a thing, if we can exclude completely from the conversation limitless potential, this intelligence it would go so far beyond evolution. I think the end result would again be something that humans might not fully recognize any longer. It may transcend the physical for all we know, such intelligence. So the idea of intelligence explosion is concomitant with the discussion of transhumanism and singularity. And I think maybe one of the, again, looking at now, I'd said earlier that maybe observation is the mother of invention more so than necessity, but during the Second World War, necessity certainly was the mother of invention. Necessity for winning the conflict spurred all kinds of different new technologies in their creation. And again, during the Second World War, more so in years before and probably in years since, we saw an intelligence sort of a technology explosion. The utilization of and the very, very, very rapid pace production of and improvement on various varieties of technologies, because literally life in the Western world and elsewhere around the globe, based on all the different powers involved, life as they knew it depended on that. And there was nothing greater than a dire necessity to spur that kind of technological explosion, that growth. So is it too far beyond the realm of the possible to suppose that, knowing that there was everything from Nazi gold to actual Nazi agents and possibly Adolf Hitler himself that may have escaped after the war? People laugh about that, but again, you got to keep in mind the skull fragment that had been kept by the Russians for years and years with the bullet hole in it, and they said that this was evidence of Hitler. It was found just a few years ago to be found, or to have belonged to a female, rather. And so it, casts a lot of questions on the potentials in terms of Hitler's whereabouts following the Russian invasion of Berlin. And so I think that what we have to look at is maybe we know parts of history. Maybe we have some of the pieces, but we don't know the full story. Maybe there were technologies that were spirited away, just like the Fuhrer himself, as some conspiracy theories say, just like Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, and so many others that allegedly escaped. Maybe some of these individuals and even their technology got around to other parts of the world, and for all we know, what crash landed at Roswell was the result of a kind of technology explosion that occurred during the World War II years, based on a technology emanating from here on Earth, but that was so exotic looking that it has literally led to an incredible instance in secrecy and cover-up and conspiracy in American history. Maybe the very finest next to the JFK assassination.
Yeah, right. And speaking of conspiracy, I can't help but, think of the idea of, there's so much talk of disclosure, of governmental disclosure, of working with the government, with other organizations for complete, public openness and disclosure on the UFO subject. There's also another school of thought that says disclosure is happening because of so many people that have had experiences and eyewitness contact or physical contact or psychic contact. What are your thoughts on the necessity of a governmental disclosure?
Well, it's interesting. I'm trying to remember who had said this recently, but the question had come up that it very well may be the case that government doesn't know much more than civilians do. In some instances, that maybe civilians actually know more about the UFO phenomenon than governments do. I've got a lot of friends and a lot of people who I've talked to over the years, who assert everything from knowledge of a vast conspiracy, knowledge of a vast cover-up, all these, different things. I mean, I don't want to say that that's not the case, but what my heart and my gut tells me is kind of along the lines of what people like Colonel John Alexander wrote about in his latest book on UFOs, which basically was this. He says that the government simply is not interested in studying UFOs. And I don't know how much more plainly that could... Now, I don't think that means that there is not information that is kept and sometimes withheld from the public about UFOs. But on the whole, the determination of the Condon Committee, the University of Colorado UFO project in the late 1960s, which effectively led to the end of Project Blue Book, the determination was not that some instances of unidentified aerial phenomenon and whatnot may not be something exotic. I don't think that the idea was to say that that there was nothing going on at all. The idea was to say that some cases in the Blue Book files cannot be explained, but we don't see any scientific merit to wasting resources on continuing to try and study this. Now, think about this. The mod UFO files, Ministry of Defense files that were released just, the latest batch that were released only recently within the last few weeks, those files determine the same thing. There was a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of resources that were put into studying UFOs for a long time by the Ministry of Defense in the UK. At the end of the day, what led them to stop was not the fact that they found no evidence. Now, sure, they didn't find any evidence of extraterrestrials, and the debunkers all use that as proof that, there's nothing going on here. No, I think that they quite clearly said the same thing that the Condon Committee had said back in the 60s. We cannot rule out all instances where something unidentifiable is truly something unidentifiable. So there are some of these things that truly, by definition, are UFOs, unidentified flying objects. But we cannot prove that they're alien or extraterrestrial. And furthermore, we cannot see merit to continuing to spend time and resources on the study of these things when they don't appear to be, A, interested in communing with us, and B, they don't appear to be a direct threat to us. So we're basically going to have to just say, okay, look, they're there. There's not a whole lot we can do about it, but we're not making any better for ourselves by continuing to pursue this phenomenon. That's something that's very important, I think, that is so often overlooked because people like to think that the government's keeping all the secrets in a big black vault someplace and that all the UFO secrets are being kept away and that Obama's been briefed and that everybody who's in the know knows and that they know all about it and that this is just being withheld from the public. I don't think that that's the case. And I think that they've been very plain in the past when they've come out and said, look, this is the reason why we have studied UFOs, but this is the reason why we've discontinued those efforts. That does not mean that UFOs don't exist. If anything, it acknowledges the presence of some phenomena from time to time that we cannot account for. Government agencies actually do acknowledge this, as the MOD had done, as the U.S. government had done with the Air Force's Project Blue Book and other such studies. But the thing is that despite the fact that we can acknowledge something is there, we cannot prove that it's extraterrestrial, and scientific applications applied to the further study of these things don't seem to be of merit according to academic institutions. Now, you or I may differ on that opinion that, and I do happen to feel that, we could probably learn a lot if we continued to try and spend some scientific, not just funding, but also some hard, scientific, get some hard scientific thought behind the UFO phenomenon in the modern era with the technologies we're armed with today. I think we might stand to gain a good bit, but, trying to convince government otherwise is going to be a trick. And so I think that while there is certainly some information that is kept clandestine, I think, and that would be for national security purposes, I think on the whole that government agencies like John Alexander and others have said they probably aren't as interested as the populace would like to think. And the overall reach of the motivations of the disclosure movement, as it were, even though I know some of those guys, Stephen Bassett is a friend, and I know some of these people personally, I don't know that there's a lot of what would you call it? I guess I'm trying to term this carefully because I want to indicate that I have full respect for what these people are doing. But I think that if we really look at how much there is behind an actual, covert element that tries to keep information from the public, I don't know that we can really assert that there's as much being kept as we think, and therefore the disclosure movement, as it were, is somewhat based on presumptuous attitudes toward UFOs. Namely, the two are that, yes, information is being withheld, and two, that they are aliens and that they may not be something else. I think we have to rectify those two conundrums. We have to say, well, we don't know that they're aliens, and two, we can't prove that government is actually hiding information. I'm sure that there's some, but maybe not as much as we think. And if we can rectify those two problems, we may be one step closer to finding out what's actually going on, which may or may not incorporate a broad-scale conspiracy to cover up the UFO phenomenon like many assert.
Right. And there's just so much testimony out there that I feel, like you said, that if the government is hiding something, it's not necessarily anything that we might not already know. With all the, the eyewitness reports, eyewitness testimonials and whatnot. A good example of that was the citizens' hearing on UFOs that happened a couple of months ago.
Right.
And, we had some what I would consider fairly respectable people showing up from the military and former senators and whatnot. I feel that I would believe them more than I would believe the government at this point anyway.
Well, I might agree with you there. I think that some of the people who were at the citizens' hearing were fantastic, and not just people who are former elected officials or government officials, pilots, generals. I think that also, in truth, some of the researchers that were there were fantastic too. Unfortunately, and again, I don't want to get into naming names, I don't think that all of the people who were there represented the field as technically and scientifically as they could have. I think that there's a lot of conjecture and a lot of presupposition, again, that caters to an extraterrestrial hypothesis that may be the case, but we simply cannot prove. And when certain individuals are sitting there in front of a bunch of former congressmen talking about aliens, abducting cows and extracting DNA and cloning humans and doing all this stuff, I simply ask them, where's the proof? And at times, surprisingly, I'm not as much of a pariah in the UFO field as many would think as a result of challenging those kind of viewpoints. If anything, I think that people largely welcome me and say, I'm glad that you asked those questions, because if we cannot ask the hard questions, and do so politely. My gosh, I hate the snarky attitude that so many people exhibit, especially online. If I challenge someone's views, I'm going to do so as politely as I can. I may have a little fun with them. I may make fun of the circumstance, but I will always tell that person at the end of the day that regardless of our differences, I respect you. It's just that I have to challenge you because I am going to challenge you in a way as a fellow researcher that will help you build a better argument that you're going to eventually present to someone who is challenging you on the grounds that they are either in opposition to you or they're trying to discredit you. And this is the thing that UFO researchers need to understand in regard to all this disclosure stuff. We have to represent ourselves carefully because the people who are out there who are potentially listening to what we have to say, they're entering this with, a tendency to probably gravitate toward disbelief. I think that's just the way our society is and the way that cultural values and ideas approach the subject of UFOs. They're going to gravitate toward disbelief, and therefore if we come to this and we say, okay, let's sit down, let's just have a dialogue, and disbeliever A, former elected official or whoever, says, okay, I'm willing to sit down and give you 1 hour. If we sit down and we try and feed the baby carrots before we feed him his applesauce, the baby's not going to be able to eat. The baby's not going to be fed. It's kind of like the nurturing, where you have to, there are orders of operation, and you have to follow a certain process. When you sit down with skeptic A, government official type, whoever, and you say, I've got 1 hour to try and bring to your attention things about the UFO phenomenon, maybe one of the first things I would bring to their attention, I would bring to, and I'm sure that this was brought up at the citizens' hearing, but I would bring a case like the Cash Landrum incident that occurred in Texas in 1980, where, again, the witnesses felt that what they saw was some sort of an advanced craft, but they never thought it was extraterrestrial. They thought it was some sort of a government craft. Now, can we prove that? We can't. As a matter of fact, Stanton Friedman, talking with him about that, my gut nonetheless tells me that this was some sort of terrestrial craft, but Stanton, again, is a person who has worked in the nuclear physics industry in terms of trying to apply nuclear physics for purposes of propulsion of aircraft. He had been doing that after graduating from, I believe it was the University of Chicago, in the same graduating class as Carl Sagan. And Stanton had gone to work for Douglas McDonald and different companies trying to design nuclear propulsion systems and things. And he told me, I can tell you, by 1980, there shouldn't have been anything like that in production that we know about. And so I don't feel that that was a craft of our own. Now, I don't remove the possibility that there could be unknown craft that are utilizing technology from here on planet Earth that have just been kept away from the public knowledge, and that maybe even someone so as in the know as Stanton Friedman would be left out of that group. That's a possibility. We have to look at that. But that case, you can't rule out the UFO factor based on merely the fact that, well, we can't prove that it was extraterrestrial, because there did appear to be a craft. There were many witnesses that saw, if not the craft, they saw the black helicopters, the Chinook helicopters that chased that thing that night. The witnesses, the primary witnesses, Betty Cash and Vicki Landrum, suffered what may have been the harmful effects of non-ionizing radiation that this craft apparently put off. They seemed to be suffering from radiation sickness. There was an actual court case involving that injury to their persons, and trying to basically address those grievances based on that. There were a lot of factors that point to an actual physical phenomenon in that case, and it may be one of the best cases to examine. It doesn't involve alien abduction. It doesn't involve extraterrestrials. It just involves a craft of unexplained origin that had a physical effect on its environment based on whatever the energy yield that craft had was capable of.
We'll be right back after the short break.
And now, back to your host, Bernard Alvarez.
Welcome back to the Just Bernard Show here on Revolution Radio. We're having a wonderful discussion today with Micah Hanks on his new book, The UFO Singularity. Before the break, we were talking with Micah about the best way to share this type of information. And I can't help but, throw this out there, and the idea that so much speculation is involved not only in ufology, but a lot in the truth movement or the conspiracy movement. And it's important that I love what Micah said, that we come off as educated critical thinkers. And I think that's probably a very, very good point. And you were making the point of this case in Texas having a lot more evidence and not saying it was extraterrestrial or non-extraterrestrial.
I don't think that we even have to address whether it was or was not extraterrestrial. Again, to me, what the evidence that has accumulated over the years, and I have to put a quick plug out for some friends. There's a program called the Paracast that my friend Chris O'Brien co-hosts, and he and Gene, the primary host, they did an excellent episode about this just last week for those who may be interested in this Cash Landrum case. There's also a Wikipedia page which, interestingly, has some information that I didn't even hear my friends there on their show addressing. And again, you can just look up the Cash Landrum incident on Wikipedia. Now, the problem with Wikipedia, of course, is that some of the good information on that page is unsourced.
Right.
So before you go and read on it, on and on online, I would say, try and find some books that deal with that subject. And of course, Jerome Clark and a number of others have written a lot about this over the years. But the reason I bring that case into question here is because, Bernard, we don't even have to look at whether we're dealing with extraterrestrials in this case. What we need to look at is the fact that there are nuts and bolts physical effects on individuals and the environment, multiple witnesses to, if not the craft itself, at least an event that occurred that night. And we need to look at this and say, okay, this is representative of something. We may not be able to tell exactly what it is representative, but this is representative of a phenomenon. And anyone who is interested in the study of UFOs should look at a case like this because of the physical effects. that can be, again, it's a little difficult to go and monitor and measure them now, but nonetheless, we have the testimony of those individuals who were possibly affected in a medical sense by being in close proximity to this craft, and it was a very flesh and blood, physical, real thing that happened. Now, another, to be brief, would be also the Valentich disappearance, where a young, I think he was only 21 years old, he was a young pilot. He was flying across the Bass Strait, headed for Australia. I think this took place in 1978, I believe. And basically what was happening is he was flying along, and as he begins to have a radio, or rather a dialogue with air traffic control in Melbourne, Australia, he begins to ask if there was any traffic at his altitude. They said no, we on our radars can see none, and he said that there was a large green object that was following him, sometimes flying in circles around him and doing strange things as he was flying his Cessna along that evening. There are researchers who have, in just recent months, and as a matter of fact, Keith Basterfield is one of them, who has a fantastic, if you search for his name, Keith Basterfield, he's got a fantastic blog that looks at scientific inquiry into UFOs. Keith Basterfield has cataloged a listing chronologically of UFO reports that occurred in the general vicinity of the Bass Strait off the southern coast of Australia within about, the hours either before or leading up to or thereafter the Valentich disappearance. Because what finally ended up happening is Frederick Valentich was flying across the Bass Strait. Is this object, a green glowing light, is basically what he described it as. It began to hover directly over him, and he told the radio dispatchers there at Melbourne, he says, the object's hovering, it's directly over me, and it's not an aircraft. And there was about 15 seconds of metallic scraping, and Valentich was never seen again. Now, there were some anecdotal reports of wreckage of what may have belonged to a Cessna that had been seen, but none was recovered. And I just find it to be a very curious circumstance, because here again we have something that was potentially very dangerous in terms of what may have happened to the individual. A UFO, we don't know what it was. It was an unidentified flying object is all we know, allegedly appeared over the Bass Strait. There were witnesses who claimed to have seen objects around the area coinciding with the time of the disappearance. And the most troubling aspect, of course, is the fact that this man, Frederick Valentich, actually disappeared. So what are we dealing with here? Again, I think that these are cases that are very important and should be looked at. And if I had an hour to sit down with a congressman, I would say, look, I'm going to show you the released Australian files that deal with the alleged disappearance of a 21-year-old pilot in 1978. I'm going to show you the reports from the proceedings of a court case that involved two women who felt that they were actually that their health may have been impaired after being in close proximity to a strange craft. I'm not going to tell you these things are alien, but I'm going to tell you that whatever these things are potentially dangerous, whatever these things are apparently physical, and that there is a plethora of other information I could show you without having to get into the speculative realm that shows that without question we are dealing with some kind of phenomenon that appears to be technological in origin, intelligently controlled, and yes, at times something that, based on the circumstances, may be harmful to humans. That, I think, would get the attention of a congressman. I wish that approach had been taken a little more at the citizens' hearing. But again, I've got good friends who were there and who participated in that, and, all the best to them, but I just think that we have to be a little more conservative in our approach. We can't throw out everything we know all at once. We have to take baby steps.
Right. Speaking of not taking baby steps, several years ago, I believe it was, when we still had G.I.C. radio, we had Sergeant Major James Norton and John Vasquez come on and speak their eyewitness account of the Fort Benning incident, and I wonder what your knowledge is of that. Apparently it was an invasion of a military installation in the United States, and apparently the government told them just to shut up. Now, the funny thing is that now, several years later, I believe all the whistleblowers but one have died fairly recently.
I don't have any direct knowledge of that case, although I do know of a lot that are similar to that. That's very compelling, very intriguing. Robert Hastings has been one who has looked at the connection between UFO sightings and military bases and things like that. I think that when a case like this happens, there are numerous instances where people who seem to be very logical, people who maybe are troubled by the apparent interaction, for lack of a better term, that they have had with a strange phenomenon, there are people who come forward and they will say, I saw that. I don't know what it is. I don't want to necessarily know or even speculate. I'm a trained pilot. I'm a trained, I've been trained in combat, or I've been a general for 45 years or whatever. There are people who come from all different walks of life who will come into these circumstances and they'll say that, regardless of what I can or cannot tell you about what happened that day, I can tell you this. I saw what I saw. I was ordered not to talk about it. There has to be good reason that people are told not to discuss these incidents. And furthermore, that a lot of people were brought into a room and sat down, and, a 4-star general shows up and tells them, rather than you can't talk about it, they're told you didn't see what you thought you saw. Yeah. Here's what you saw. And again, this is something that's been a point of contention over the years, is that there have been a lot of people who have worked in officialdom who have said, yeah, I was told to say that I didn't see what I know I saw, and what I saw was a disc-shaped object blasting a laser at a missile, apparently disarming the thing, and it spun out of control and then was completely, however much money was put into trying to arm a missile for a test like this, was lost, and what we were left with was footage of a UFO flying in close proximity to this test missile, this warhead in flight, apparently disarming it and then zipping off. And I'm told that, no, I didn't see that. Yeah, I did. And so, this has always been a contentious point, because what obviously appears to be happening is that there are instances where these UFOs take great interest in military activities and in the actual localities of, military bases and things like that. And when they do that, for whatever reason, they appear to have a very almost preemptive kind of attitude talking about the UFOs, if we can append such thing as an attitude to a UFO craft. They appear to exhibit an attitude that is, there are certain things we are going to allow you to do. There are certain things we're not going to allow you to do. Now it's interestingly, a lot of people, including Robert Hastings, who's written the book about this, UFOs and Nukes, he says, what this seems to point to for me is evidence that we're dealing with some sort of a technology. And this technology is obviously not our own. It's something from someplace else, probably alien, and that they're, again, here to try and protect us from ourselves. And I interviewed Robert on my Gralien Report podcast a while back and said, well, but Robert, I don't know that I agree with you. Again, their vested interest in military happenings and worldly affairs, to me, more potentially betrays the evidence of a technology that feels that they have something either to gain or lose from worldly affairs. In other words, we could look at this as everything from something so far out as there being aliens that are based here on planet Earth, and they're like, okay, hey, look, this is our home base. We don't want the place to go up in flames, so we're going to try and, ride herd on you guys a little while we're here. That's probably more science fiction than it is science fact. What we know is that if there's a technology that appears to be on planet Earth, that this technology is involving itself in earthly affairs, and government agencies and things like that aren't talking about it publicly, but that there is historical precedent for it based on the testimony of credible witnesses that have been collected over several decades. What I think that says is that we have to re-examine UFOs and their intentions, and based on their actions, it betrays a lot about their potential involvement with earthly affairs. And maybe if they're involved in earthly affairs, maybe this is a technology that is more terrestrial in nature than we would give it credit for. In other words, maybe despite its exotic appearance, it's something that has a lot more to do with Earth happenings.
It could very well be. We hear so much about technology now. What is it? The invisibility hologram plane now that they have, or they're working on. Yeah. So anything is possible, and I think that's the point that you're trying to make here, that anything is possible, and we have to stay open to allowing the facts to come in. Just alone in the UFO eyewitness accounts, we hear different, like you said, different size ships. We see orbs or colored lights. A great example is the Phoenix Lights. So many people saw that, and they saw the same configuration, they saw the same shape, but it wasn't a flying saucer. It wasn't a mothership, or maybe it was a fleet. I have no idea. Maybe it was a fleet from a test airplane or something. But can you tell us a little bit what your ideas were or your hypothesis of what the Phoenix Lights was?
Well, with regard to the Phoenix Lights, that's an interesting case, by the way. I think at the time that it happened, Governor Fife Samington, I believe was his name, famously came out and gave this press release where they brought an alien, or it was a person dressed like an alien on stage. They really just made a mockery of the entire thing. And then later, I think it may have been the UFO Hunters program on History Channel that interviewed him and had the former governor saying, in truth, I saw the things myself, and I was told to give that press release so that public opinion would look at it and begin to downplay it, as we intentionally did. Now, why elected officials and government agencies would intentionally try and downplay something like that when the governor himself had said, yes, I was there and I saw it? That's there are any number of reasons that do kind of get into the realm of conspiracy. I'll tell you again, I'd mentioned my friend Chris O'Brien earlier, and he's best known, he's about to be best known right now for a book that's coming out on cattle mutilations called Stalking the Herd. And, he's going to be a speaker at Paradigm Symposium this year as well. And Chris told the funniest story a while back to me about the Phoenix Lights. He said that the night that the Phoenix Light incident took place, that rather than being out there stalking tricksters or cattle mutilators or UFOs or anything, he said, I was in Phoenix, but I was in a hotel room because I'd been passing through the area and there was a ball game on that I really wanted to watch. And he said, I was sitting there watching the ball game and I hear this commotion going on outside, and he runs outside, and people said that a great big light or a series of lights had just passed overhead. So here's Chris O'Brien sitting there in his hotel room, and he's like, whoa, I'm a UFO investigator. So he's getting information. People are telling him what they'd seen. He just missed it. It was all over the news the next day, though, of these now famous Phoenix Lights that he just barely missed them by that much, as old Maxwell Smart would have said. So I think it's very funny that this happens often for UFO investigators, that they always seem to be one step behind the phenomenon, and they get there just in time to talk to a bunch of people who have seen something incredible in the skies above them. The Phoenix Lights, there were a number of witnesses, and I've spoken with a number of people who were in Phoenix or who actually saw the lights over the years, and they all seem to agree that what they felt was that those were not flares. Some people actually, as opposed to just seeing the lights hovering at a distance, that they'd actually seen these lights moving overhead and passing over them. That they appeared to represent either several craft flying in formation, or perhaps, and this is kind of creepy based on the spacing between the lights and the area that they would have covered, but the other interpretation is that there may have actually been one single large object. If that were the case, I mean, we are talking about something massive. Now, I don't know. There are a lot of unknown quantities with the Phoenix Lights, and we could speculate all day, but what we do know is that, again, the governor at the time had claimed that he had been one of the witnesses. There were a number of people who had seen these things. The official explanation doesn't seem to jive with what witness cases or witness reports seem to entail. And to me, that case, regardless of what the lights may have actually been, we can be certain that there is at least a mystery there, and I think it remains a mystery.
Absolutely, and it's definitely probably one of the most famous mysteries as far as dealing with something of this nature. We have about 10 more minutes left, and I wanted to jump a little bit onto another aspect of your book. You talk a little bit about future technologies and time travel. Does the idea of a holographic universe come into play when we're discussing future technologies and time travel? How do you feel about that? Our reality could be some kind of digital simulation, as some philosophers have begun to express.
That's a good question. And I do feel that is possibly something that comes into question. I think Michael Talbot was the one that wrote a book called The Holographic Universe a while back. It is both a scientific premise that people have been articulating over the years. It's also a philosophical concept that gets into the roots of epistemology, and in terms of what we're studying, how much of what we perceive do we really know with certainty? How could you or I, Bernard and Micah, are walking down a sidewalk, enjoying a cup of coffee, and we're continuing our conversation off air. We're walking down the road, and then a pink luminescent individual that looks sort of like a human but somewhat like a turtle begins to manifest in front of us, and then it disappears. Now, Bernard and I could look at this and we could say a number of things. We could say, did you just see that? Yes, I did. Did you just see that? Obviously, I just asked you. Okay, we have corroborating witnesses. We've both seen something strange. Now, did anyone else around us see this? Have we been deluded? Was there some sort of a physical environmental factor that caused only us to see this? Were we both imaginating? Have we shared a hallucination? Was there an entity? Was there a demon, a devil, a person, a creature, a monster, an alien? I mean, all different kinds of things come into question. And philosophy has, since the beginning of rational thought, sought to try and look at strange circumstances, phenomenon, any kind of mysterious, natural, anything that goes on in the world around us, and at times also what may be, categorically non-natural phenomenon. I wouldn't call UFOs a natural kind of phenomenon. But I would say that since the beginning of logical inquiry into our surroundings, we have sought to try and understand how we know what we know. And René Descartes, of course, talked about what if I'm dreaming? What if I'm being deceived by a demon? And in modern terms, one kind of revision of that classic Cartesian argument is the idea that what if what we perceive as reality is kind of like what we see in the Matrix films? What if what we perceive as reality is actually our interaction with a matrix, a hologram, or some kind of some sort of a synthetic reality that is generated, kind of like how we would create an artificial environment with a computer. Now, James Sylvester Gates is one of many whose, I guess his scientific work is something I've looked into in the past, and I also cited a paper he co-authored when I was giving a lecture at the International UFO Congress earlier this year. And I found what Dr. Gates has to say is very interesting. What he believes he has found in his study of supersymmetry and string theory and things like this is that he feels that there are mathematical codes that are very similar to the kind of computer coding, binary and different kinds of coding and things that are utilized in computers. He feels that woven into the complex mathematics that we would apply to string theory, that he feels that there is evidence for synthetic aspects of our universe. And if these can be likened to computer codes, this kind of brings into question the idea of what if our universe as we know it is what we would liken to being a computer reality, a synthetic generated matrix reality. I don't think this is outside the realm of the possible, and while with what we have in terms of scientific ability to try and further our understanding of that, we're left more with a philosophical argument than an actual scientific principle. I think that it's still an important question to ask because, again, if in the future we utilize technologies, or someone does, that can evade time and temporality, what if we can also utilize technologies that are capable of rendering everything from an environment to an individual to a consciousness? We could all be artificial intelligence within that context. And so, yes, I think that we have to look at, from time to time, the realistic potential that there are technologies that may be influencing what we perceive as being reality, and that the reality that we think we know may not be reality at all, or it very well may be something that is capable of being controlled, but by whom? And that's the great question.
That's very interesting. Like I said earlier, as a metaphysician, I find all of this very fascinating, especially the Buddhist undertones to that type of philosophy. Whereas, like you said, the Matrix it's an illusion. Are we the ones that are creating that illusion? There's a lot of esoteric talk that what we think we're creating, that just because we observe it, it makes it real, versus the idea of it being there before you actually perceive it. Kind of like the new quantum mechanics that are being investigated, that the perceiver is actually what creates the characteristic.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there's so many questions that could be asked about what we think we perceive and what we think we know. And with UFOs, I finally got to a point a couple of years ago where my interest in philosophy kind of converged with my interest in UFOs, because I've begun to realize everything that we think that we know about UFOs is largely based on presuppositions. There's very little that we actually do know, maybe even less that we're actually able to go out there and experiment with, if we're able to experiment with it. And so, for me, it came down to a point of questioning, again, what do we really know, and how can we know that we know? Which a lot of people probably kind of look at it. I've had people tell me, say, you are doing us no favors in terms of your approach to this, because, although you're trying to think critically, you're also throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so you've basically started all over again and taken 50 years or more of serious inquiry into this phenomenon, and you're saying that that's no good. I'm not saying that at all. Of course, there are these potentials, and maybe the extraterrestrial component is one of those. And I think that, after about 40 or 50 years, while that should be still kept into consideration, if that were indeed the only explanation behind the UFO phenomenon, we should know more about that phenomenon than we apparently do. We should be able to reconcile with that phenomenon better than we have been able to, or than we have exhibited presently that we're able to do. And in the present day, the fact that we've moved forward very little in terms of new mastery of this subject indicates a lot to me. And so I think that we have to, from time to time, as the old masters in the Orient said, we have to empty our cup so that we can pour new tea into it. Because if we try and keep our cup filled all the time, there's no room for new knowledge. And what ends up having inevitably is that you pour your tea into a filled cup and it just overflows and you have a great big mess. You have to empty your cup from time to time and start over if you want to have new tea.
Sounds good. I like that philosophy, actually. I use it regularly. Let me
teacup too.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there you go. Let me ask you, though, on your personal, let's say from a personal level, do you feel there are other forms of intelligence out there that might try to make contact with us?
On a personal level, if I had to just tell you, Bernard, this is what I feel, I couldn't back this up, but, maybe probability has led me to feel that this is a likelihood. Yeah, I think that there are other intelligences out there. I think that there are physical flesh and blood aliens that exist out there. I think that there's a possibility Earth may have been, if not visited. Again, I think that people like to say we're being visited. Well, I would argue to the contrary that maybe there are instances where intelligences have sought to attempt to communicate with humans, but that would not necessarily have to entail physical travel from one planet or star system to planet Earth. In other words, alien contact could be going on in our midst right now. Mm-hmm. And people who study shamanic practices, or people who have been psychonauts and utilized entheogens and God releasing substances and things like that, hallucinogens essentially. Maybe these people have actually already made contact. That could be occurring on a number of different levels of our reality and our perception. And UFOs, if we were to find out that the UFO phenomenon was all terrestrial, it was all a government conspiracy, it was all technology, it was from right here in our backyard on planet Earth, I think that we could still have UFOs and there's still be plenty, and that'd be a terrestrial phenomenon, by the way, and still there'd be plenty of potential for the existence of alien extraterrestrial beings from other planets, and even maybe the potentials for contact between us and them. So yeah, in my heart I feel that that's the case. I just can't prove, and this is what I always try and make people understand. I say I'm skeptical, and they say, so you don't believe. Don't bring belief into it. When I study UFOs, that's one thing. I'll tell you what I can observe and what I can tell you based on those observations and what the data pertains to and what it seems to reveal. But when it comes to aliens, it's all an emotional matter, and in my gut I know that there's life out there.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Micah. We got to wrap things up ever so quickly. I want to thank you so much for joining us this week here on the Just Bernard Show. It's been such a great pleasure.
Oh, the pleasure's been mine.
And we'll see you all next week with Miriam Delicato, contactee herself. Have a great week, everyone. Bye-bye.
There is no denying the world is awakening. We see it in the global uprisings and demonstrations of the people around the planet and the new way of thinking and living that is arising naturally within each one of us and our communities. I have been a major player in this global shift and movement for over 20 years and have helped tens of thousands of people around the world change their lives and find their voice in order to help create the paradigm change we so desperately need. Join me here at Revolution Radio on the Just Bernard Show every Tuesday at noon Eastern Time for 2 hours of powerful interviews and discussion with some of the most influential visionaries of consciousness, alternative media, and suppressed knowledge. We promise to reveal the real matrix and empower your human experience.